Good afternoon. Welcome to Reimagining Education, conversations on character, commitment, and community. For those of you joining us for the first time, this series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative here at Duke University, which seeks to make character, purpose, and meaning central to education and pre-professional and professional education in particular. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Kenan Institute for Ethics, the institutional home for this initiative and series. Before we jump in, two logistical notes. Please know that there are several folks working behind the scenes should we have any Zoom troubles, which there are often many. Also, please note that you should submit your questions through the Q&A mechanism, and they'll be passed on directly to me. We do our very best to get us to as many questions as possible, but sometimes we don't get to them all. The conversation will go on for about 40 minutes, and then we open it up to Q&A. And with that, I am beyond delighted to introduce Olin College President and President-elect of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Gilda Barabino, who'll be talking with us today on how engineering can create cultures of belonging. Educated at Xavier College and Rice University, Gilda has played a number of higher education leadership roles, including serving as professor and dean at the City College of New York's Grove School of Engineering. She was associate chair for graduate studies and professor of biomedical engineering at Georgia Tech and Emory. At Georgia Tech, she also served as the inaugural vice provost for academic diversity. Prior to Georgia Tech and Emory, she rose through the ranks as professor of chemical engineering and was vice provost for undergraduate education at Northeastern. She is a noted investigator in the areas of sickle cell disease, cellular and tissue engineering, and the role of race, ethnicity, and gender in science and engineering. Gilda is also a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the National Academy of Medicine, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, lots of academies. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, the American Institute for Medical and Biomedical Engineering, and the Biomedical Engineering Society. She is past president of the Biomedical Engineering Society and past president of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. She serves on the scientific advisory board of the Chan Zuckerberg BioHub, the National Science Foundation's Committee for Engineering, the congressionally mandated Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, and the National Academy's Committee on Women, Engineering, and Medicine, which she chairs. She consults nationally and internationally on STEM education and research, diversity and higher education policy, faculty, and workforce development. Hard to imagine she has time to be president of Olin College, which she started last July. And let's just say she jumped into a firestorm of a year. So welcome, Gilda.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thanks for that kind introduction.
It's wonderful to have you here today. So I'm hoping we can do three things in this conversation. First, we would love to hear about the Olin model of engineering, which is quite creative and ambitious. Hear a little bit about your emergent vision for Olin. Have you reflected a bit on this past year? And then I'm hoping we might think about things we might glean from your work at Olin and how they might help us think about professions and professional education in other domains, if that sounds reasonable to you.
Sounds great.
Good, wonderful. So Olin has been around for almost 20 years now. I'm hoping for those unfamiliar with this creative and capacious vision, you could give us a little sense of what makes Olin special. There are lots of things around the design-centered curriculum, the role of liberal arts, and the fact there's no tenure. As some of the things, but sort of what is that vision and what drew you to Olin College?
Well, the vision and what drew me to Olin was that it was designed to transform engineering education. It's designed to be innovative and to be a source of constant innovation and change, designed to be student-centered, designed so that the projects and the work that engineers were doing, or engineers in training, was student-centered, project-based, real-world problems, designed to do good in the world. And interestingly, as part of their founding precepts, it was also designed to have gender equity. So this combination of doing good in the world through engineering and having students at the center and working on project-based collaborative and working on real world problems is a real draw. And to do that in an innovative way, like we are basically a laboratory. So we prototype, we try new things, and we see what works. And we, again, keep the students at the center, working collaboratively on teams with one another, but with faculty. So faculty are guiding and co-creating with the students at the same time.
Wonderful. So one of the things I think is very noteworthy about the mission at Olin is something you described in your academic year kickoff, where you talked about the dual mission of educating exemplary engineers and leading the transformation of engineering education through constant change and innovation informed by equity and social justice. Could you talk a little bit about that, flesh it out for us some?
Yeah, so if we think about it, engineering begins and ends with people. And so the work that we're doing should actually be human-centered, people-centered. The work that we're doing should be designed that actually has some real-world solutions that are going to make the world better, improve lives, help the well-being of humans. And we're not even just thinking about humans, but also the well-being of the planet. So this idea that you are actually using engineering purposefully and with this thinking about the social dynamics and how the technology is being used and who has access to the technology, who is having the opportunity to even become an engineer, and what is it that we are learning as engineers, and to do it holistically, not just looking at the technology, but also integrating humanities and the arts, and integrating entrepreneurship, and integrating how do you actually work towards public good. So that combination is really what we're looking at now. And then how do you do that in the future that is even more sustainable, that brings it to be more affordable and more equitable for all populations? That's where we're headed in the future.
So two questions here. One, is your sense that faculty and students are in particular drawn to Olin because of that mission and that way of thinking? And two, for the non-engineers, could you give an example of what that looks like in practice in terms of the education?
So I do think that individuals who might be drawn to Olin are really wanting to do something different and have some change in the world and use engineering in that way, and also open, very much open to trying new things and not afraid of the ambiguity of the constant change. So I think those things are important as you think about it, and also being in a community where others are like-minded and are looking for the same kinds of things. So when we say what our values are and what it is we represent, it's very much like, this is what it is. So if this is the kind of environment you want to join, if this is the type of engineers you want to work with, this is the place for you. So an example of how everything really is, student-centered and real-world problems. Many of our courses bring in multiple disciplines, and there is a real-world problem that the students are actually working on. And they are actually working on these problems of their choice. So finding out what the needs are, identifying those needs, people-centered problems, coming up with the solutions that you need. I think that is that type of model resonates with those who really want to have that kind of independence, learn by doing, have the work that they're doing be impactful, and have some technical expertise along the way.
Wonderful. So one of the phrases you used was about ambiguity, so that people need to be good with ambiguity. Certainly there are lots of 18-year-olds, right, headed off to college next fall who want to make the world a better place in different ways. They're not so good with ambiguity. Is that a challenge at Olin with students, or are you selecting both on the faculty side and the student side for individuals who are open to letting the process unfold, as it were?
Yeah, so it's funny because it's hard. So when you think about innovation and constant change, you have to be willing to put yourself out there. You have to be willing to try new things. You have to be willing to understand that you might try it and it might not work. So this idea of the openness to try it, it might fail, but you try again. And I think what we're looking for more is the openness to try new things. That's really the essence of it. And the understanding that you may fail, but try again. So the prototyping and trying and then seeing when you do have success, and then understanding when something works, it is such a rewarding situation to be in, especially when what you're doing has impact for others. So I think it's really this openness and understanding that just because it didn't work, it doesn't mean that all has failed. That helps one deal with the ambiguity, because you start to learn that this is how it works. You try, and then there are other things that can work. You prototype, you may stick with that, you may move with something else, but the learning in the process, the learning by doing, absolutely helps with dealing with ambiguity.
So one of the things that strikes me is in that description, bringing in students who are open, but who really build this skill of managing and navigating ambiguity, confronting and moving beyond failure. Do you think of your graduates as perhaps more resilient in the world?
I do. I think that's part of the training that you get. So you mentioned also, like, just thinking about what else is different about us in the interdisciplinarity. We don't have departments. We work across disciplines. Many of our faculty members are experts in multiple areas. And so bringing that sort of interdisciplinary approach makes a difference for sure. And I think that this working collaboratively towards these problems that might seem too big to tackle, but then you tackle them in a collaborative team environment that's supportive, it really does help with resilience and other types of skills that we need when we go out in the world, regardless of what it is that we're going to work on. And the other piece of it that I think is really important is bringing in the social component and understanding the social dynamics associated with technology, developing technology and using technology, how that technology is used responsibly, and then the possibility that it's distributed in ways that are uniform and not inequitable. So what's the point of having great innovations if only certain subgroups have access to those innovations?
So one of the things that I think is so interesting about Olin is how the vision matches structure. And so you talk about not having departments. It's right, the absence of something like tenure, these traditional structures of higher education. And so for your vision, it responds with very definitive structures. Is there a temptation in the community at points to resort to those structures? So I think about this incredibly stressful past year, and under stress, do you think, oh, maybe we need those things? Or is it so part of the culture that there's not even a resort to traditional structures in conversation or thinking?
So we're human. So, and in that humanity, I do think there's a tendency, and especially when there's the stress, the immediate reaction is like, oh, maybe we need some more conventional structure to help us feel safer. Mm-hmm. But the good thing that I like about the Olin community, it's like, okay, wait, that was the initial reaction. We're Olin. We can do things differently. And with the pandemic and the having to go remote, imagine if your whole structure, everything is around being in person, team-based, small groups. The part of the essence and the attraction is this interactions with faculty that are so intense and so useful. What do you do when you have to go remote? The community got creative and thought of like, how do we try to capture in a remote setting what it is that was so strong about those interactions between the faculty and the students, the interactions between students with each other. We sent kits around the world. We had the Miro, which is an electronic whiteboard. We used those things, but everyone became even more creative about what are some ways we can try to capture that in-person experience, the working together. Even one class we had was around weaving and technology, and we sent looms across the country for those who were in the class. I have a loom myself. So just ability to be creative and thinking about how do you still work together as a community really did help. And it allowed us to think about what is the essence that is so critical that makes us who we are. That reflection has really been helpful.
So I really admire these efforts in thinking about our work here at the Kenan Institute, which I have always imagined is very face-to-face, whether it's in working with students or with community members. And it sounds like you all really embrace this challenge and try to figure out how to move forward. Are there things that you learned in that pivot that you think you can take moving forward and help reinforce what's special about Olin?
Sure, I think there are many things that we learned in the pivot, some of which was part of Olin's core and the culture and how people operated. But we learned a bit, like some of that you really need to double down on. So I'll give you one example. Olin has this real tradition of storytelling and narratives and sharing those stories with one another. That is a huge, fantastic way of staying connected. Because in fact, part of how we connect one human to another is sharing stories. We want to know, we want to know your business. We want to know like what is going on in your life. So the power of the storytelling came out even more so. We understood the power of community gatherings. So we did many different types of community gatherings, even if they were virtual. We put a tent up outside and came together in different community events under the tent. But some of it was not even just the mechanism, but it's the idea that you need multiple touch points. You need ways for the community to feel connected. And I think part of what is the Olin experience, and our students get that from day one, is this sense of being cared for, this sense of being part of a community that values you for who you are, lets you bring your whole self to the institution, to your community, stays in touch with how you're doing. We learn that you need to be even more intentional. So if you have a very supportive type community, you start to take it for granted that everybody's connected. But when you were in a situation where you were remote, you have to be more intentional about how do those connections take place, and how do you hear voices, and how do you make sure that everyone is cared for and feeling okay. So I think those are some of the things that we learned about what we do and who we are, but how you need to do that even more so, and what are the things that really serve as the glue that keeps the community together.
Can you talk a little bit about how you're bringing your commitments around diversity, equity, inclusion to Olin, and how they're implicating the community that you're creating?
Sure.
How are you thinking about that?
So this sense that we need to have equity and inclusion within and through engineering, this sense that we actually need to connect the social dynamics with engineering is not separate, the sense that we need access and affordability for engineering, and even for higher education more broadly. So when you combine those things, I think that again, that's been a huge part of the attraction that I've had to come here. But how do we do that in new and innovative ways that really does make a difference? And how do you tap into this culture that is constant innovation and change? And how do we use engineering responsibly? How do we transform for the next generation and what needs to go in the future? Putting all that together. And the piece about equity and inclusion, that's something that should be part of anyone's culture. And you have to infuse that within the culture and the environment. You have to make sure that voices are heard, like I was saying earlier, that people feel part of that community. And that, I think, is really key to showing that commitment to a inclusive environment that supports everyone. And, you know, we talked earlier too about what is even going on with the pandemic. I think that's made us all see the inequities that exist and the disproportionate impact of a pandemic of any kind on different populations. And so the importance of making sure that we are training for a world that is more equitable.
So one of the things you've written that I was really struck by was a piece last September in Science, where you talked about dismantling systemic racism in higher education will require efforts to think and operate in new ways beyond existing programs that support students of color. Those efforts are typically targeted to individuals, and what's needed in addition are efforts that promote institutional change. And you went on to describe Olin in a very provocative way, which you say, Olin, for example, is committed to applying a co-creation model of change, where students, faculty, and administration work together, that relies on a combination of leadership, shared responsibility, and accountability, courageous and effective discourse, mutual understanding, community engagement, and design approaches that have the potential for meaningful change. And there are a couple of things in here that I think are really interesting. One is the co-creation piece. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that? And then can you also talk about why the engineering design approach might be perfectly suited to lead this kind of broader cultural change?
Sure. So let me back up a little bit and say why I think it's so important to think about structural change. Oftentimes, their interventions, they're targeted towards the individuals and treating the individuals who have been left out through no fault of their own as if they are the problem. And so what we really need is to change our environment so that they are welcoming and supportive of all individuals. So that's one part of it. And to do that, we need to create work that supports that kind of mission. So I would love to give a specific example of how Olin does that. So we have a number of classes, as I mentioned earlier, that cross different disciplines and boundaries. The students get involved and pick their projects. And there's this design to do a real world problem to do good in the world. So a course that is a great example is called Engineering for Humanity. And so it's a partnership, and one of the faculty members who is helping to run that course is an anthropologist. So in partnership with a community of older adults, our students go in, they work with the older adults, they spend time with them, they come up with them as their partners to identify some unmet need that would help improve their daily lives. And that is the project that they're now designing on. So they are designing, it's user-centered, it's user-oriented, they're working with a person. So they might end up talking with a group, so now they have a person that they're working for. And they're coming up with a design, again, that's gonna help their lives. We don't know when they go in what that design is gonna be. In one case, the students came up as a team, and they came up with this backpack for a portable oxygen carrier that actually would have helped a person in the facility be able to be more mobile. So that's just one example, but there's so many of them. We do what we call affordable design and entrepreneurship. And in this course, not only are students learning how to design for something an unmet need, the students pick the project. But in this case, it also needs to serve underserved communities, and it needs to be affordable. So it's combining those ideas of access, equity, user-centered, real-world problems, making someone's life better. That combination is what I'm talking about. And you get that in an environment that supports that, and the curriculum is designed as such. So imagine if you're working on those kinds of projects and it's constant of how is this going to be used in the world. By the time you finish and you've done multiple projects that way, you do have a sense of not just your place in the world, but how you are actually helping others.
Wonderful. How do we take this, right, this model and these ways of thinking and bring them into other environments? So if you were, right, part of your mission is about changing engineering education more generally, nationally, internationally. How do we think about doing this in places that weren't created precisely to do this?
So I think that's where partnerships come in. So, and Olin actually does have a history of bringing others in, come see what we do. And then you can take what you see and see if you can apply it in your context. We also have a history of going out to others and spending some time in their environment and sharing. But I think developing and expanding on those types of activities in true partnership long-term, just trying it out. That's the whole thing about prototyping and being more of an experimental test bed, for example. So what works here, elements of that could work very well in another context. And so that kind of partnership, and it doesn't have to be limited to others in engineering. We could collaborate. Recently, we had conversations with people at Wesleyan. We have a partnership now that exists between Babson, Olin, and Wellesley, a longstanding partnership that allows business and liberal arts to connect with engineering. So those partnering opportunities, I think, will really continue, and we can expand on those to make a bigger difference in the future.
So here at Duke, they recently instituted a new first-year requirement, which is a design course led by the fabulous Ann Satterback here at Pratt, which I think is similar to what you're describing. And I think it's really been transformative for students. As an ethics institute, we're always interested in how engagement with a holistic sense of design promotes character, promotes virtue, creates commitment of individuals to society in particular ways. Is there any emphasis at Olin on character or thinking about character, or is that sort of a space too far for you all?
No, I think that, one way we approach it is having students think about how their technology is being used, having students research and understand the social context around a particular design. And those are some opportunities to bring in the ethics component. We also think about building character through having purpose and working on teams, working collaboratively, thinking about what you're working on outside of yourself and how it's being used for others. We give students some opportunities to reflect, even officially in the courses, so that you're thinking about what motivates you, like what's your self-motivation, but then how is it used other ways? And how do you tie that to doing good in the world? And what are those things that we should be thinking about, are the problems that we're trying to solve? So those ways of operating, ways of being, ways of doing, the working together, the collaboration, again, thinking of more than just yourself, those all contributed to the character part of it. And also I think that I tie it in with the purpose as well, because if you are constantly thinking about a purposeful life, like, what am I gonna do with myself? Like, why am I doing this? And how is it impacting society? that sense of purpose and using engineering for good and combining that and constantly doing that, as they have the opportunity to do in so many courses throughout their entire time at Olin, I think that ties in very well.
Wonderful. Can we talk a little bit more about this past year, and in particular, how you might be thinking differently about issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and or are you kind of doubling down on your structural vision? Are there any moments at which you thought, I want to try this differently, I want to think about this differently?
Well, I would say there's certainly emphasis on doing what we do well. But I will tell you this, one of the things that I thought was really important was I talk about reflection. I think as any institution starts thinking about what is their place in the world and how are they contributing to eliminating inequities and being more equitable and more just, you have to look at yourself first. So we talk here about getting beyond talk and what are we doing? Because no one needs more empty statements. What we need is action. And so I really feel excited about the Olin community being willing to work with me to have those tough conversations, to reflect and look at ourselves and what is it we are doing that works and what could we do more of? How could we be more open and more broad in the net that we cast in trying to bring people in? How can we be more supportive for those who are here? How can we be more supportive and think about the impact we're having on the world? So we don't just talk about what are some things that or some problems we should be looking at in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's do them. What are those things? Our students are part of a network around public interest technology and being very mindful and purposeful about participation in those types of activities, the awareness, talking about it. We have a community that says, you know what, we may not know as much as we should know around these topics, particularly around racial injustice. How are we going to educate ourselves? And with that education, what are we going to do with it? So it's a work in progress. There's a lot more that we can do, but I love the commitment to do something, not just talk, but to actually do.
So I love that, beyond talk. That's a great way to put it. In that effort at Olin, are there other places that you look around and say, that's kind of an interesting thing to think about or to try? Or is the conversation really Olin-centric?
So we think we're great, but we know we can learn from others. So, and so I think there's this constant look to what is happening other places, educating ourselves about the broader issues in the world. One area that Olin's been good about looking out with others, like through the national academies, there's the National Academy of Engineering, there's a Grand Challenge Scholars Program. We participate in that. I mentioned the public interest technology. So we do look at what else is going on in the world and where can we learn from others through partnership. It could be through an organization, it could be through a foundation, but there's so many ways that we can tap into that type of expertise or other experiences and then bring that into Olin. We love to talk about the Olin Way and compare like what it is we're seeing and is that Olin-esque or not. So there are absolutely ways that we want to have this two-way street of us going out into the world, bringing the world in, and that exchange. Just like we have that exchange with our students and our faculty, we also bring our staff into the learning community. Like our goal, thinking about the future, is that everyone sees themselves as a learner and an educator, both inside Olin and outside of Olin.
So if you think in the next 5 to 8 years, you talk about the Olin way and Olin-esque, or I was thinking about Olinizing things. Sort of what do you think you would hope would be different when you say the Olin Way 5 to 8 years from now?
I would like to see that we have tackled bigger problems, particularly those that seem intractable. So this idea of, can we have education, even beyond engineering, that is accessible and affordable and sustainable? Can we have education that really works to eliminate systemic racism and eliminate injustices? Education is such a powerful tool to make the world a better place. Education is such a powerful tool to eliminate inequities. And those equities, extend to many areas: health, wealth, and so on. But, using this way of approaching learning, the way of approaching doing good in the world in such a big way that we really can see this kind of impact. And we think globally. We don't think, just about our immediate environments, but how do we take that message out and actually demonstrate that kind of change in a big way on a really big problem?
Well, that's certainly capacious. Sort of the idea of the Olin Way being kind of universalized as an approach to education that's really both transformative, equitable, and sustainable is
That's it.
really something. Yep. That'd be tremendous. Are there things that we might learn from Olin in its approach to engineering that we might think about applying to other professions or professional schools? And I know that's asking you to kind of jump into a different space, but I wonder if there's something you might reflect on there.
Well, I actually think that it's really important sometimes to just think like an engineer. And sometimes the reason why we don't make more progress is because we treat things in such solo, narrow situations where we need more of a systems approach. We need more of a systems way of thinking. We need more of a way of connecting multiple things. And I really do believe that that type of systems approach works well in the Olin environment, in the way we look at the world and prototyping and trying new things. So that kind of approach could be used in any area. You can use it in the arts. You can use it in business settings. You could use it in social settings where we're like, here's this real social problem. Why aren't we making a difference? Well, maybe it's because it's interconnected and interrelated, and we need to take more of a systems approach. The other thing I think is really important that we do, we cross boundaries. We blur boundaries. We look at new things and innovations that can happen at intersections of disciplines. And then we think about, maybe we should create something new. Maybe there should be a new discipline coming out of that. And that is the power of making a difference in these other fields as well. Like, why are we treating everything separately? Why don't we merge more of the humanities with engineering or business, all of that? And I think we've been doing that a lot and seeing the power of that. I think that's going to happen even more so in the future as our problems become more and more complex. The only way we're going to make a difference is if we continue to blur those boundaries and work together across those disciplines.
Wonderful. So the suggestions are blurring and systems thinking.
Yes.
Sounds great. Why don't we jump into our first question from the audience, which is, can you describe the most effective external partnerships for student learning projects and how those partnership efforts have worked at Olin?
Well, I do think there's been some success with institutions over time who said, we want to become more project-based, or we want to become more of blending across the disciplines. So there was one that Olin did with the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign with the Granger School of Engineering, the Granger College of Engineering. And there's one that Olin did with a group in Brazil. So this idea of like spending time together with people who are steeped in the Olin way of teaching, and those in the whoever you're partnering with is spending that kind of time together and doing some co-creation together across the different institutions. Those are the kinds of partnerships that seem to have worked well and have had some lasting results, where someone can actually say, this is how I've incorporated what I've learned from Olin, and now we have these courses that are more project-based or more hands-on learning.
So just a quick follow-up there. I was thinking about, right, this great example you used about student projects. How do you ensure that, right, the projects, right, that you're reaching a broad enough range of stakeholders to really be able to identify and address the kinds of challenges around structural racism and inequities in our society? So how does that outreach work so that students have the exposure to those diverse populations and diverse views as they're doing their design work?
Well, some of it is having some intentionality about who you decide to partner with. And so, maybe working with an organization that has as their target, as their goal of working with underserved populations. So that's one way to do it. But I'll tell you also, there is so much around inequities pervasive in our society that you can pick almost anything and find like what in there is not necessarily so fair. So for example, even just working with the older adults, there's ageism, there's all sorts of things that we do within our society that are not necessarily inclusive and the best way of valuing different populations. So we almost don't have to work too hard to find those problems because they're there and it's so pervasive. But what we're trying to do is have students be conscious and look for and think about what these things are. And then when they're talking to stakeholders, really get to know them, really get to know what might be a problem in their lives. Some of it is around outreach where you work with populations and K-12 outreach, for example, and maybe you're in schools where they don't have as many resources. So one thing in engineering, if you think about, where you might help with inequities or where there's under-resourcing or where there's areas where the pollution tends to be disproportionately impacting a particular neighborhood or community. So being cognizant of those types of things and trying to match that up. So it is hard. So you raise a good point, but we work at looking for ways to make sure that we have that kind of breadth.
Well, I think it's a bit sobering that, as you note, inequities are everywhere. So perhaps easier to find than we might hope. Next question. Do you provide faculty training on how to infuse ethics and/or purpose into their courses? So are those conversations about purpose really explicit? What would that training look like? And how might you overcome resistance?
Well, fortunately, I would say that the faculty are looking for those opportunities to train themselves and each other. And so there's a lot of how do you learn? Like what is the expertise that's out there, finding it and then sharing it. And then there's a lot of sharing across the whole community. So we don't necessarily have a formal training program in ethics, but we certainly look to our faculty who maybe have some special expertise in the area. We look to outside experts who are working with us. Sometimes we might have a project that's with an external partner that looks at those areas. So the training is happening in a sense, the learning around it a bit more organically, but certainly it's a learning community. And I think that a lot of that happens as we go.
So it seems that this notion of a learning community, both among students and faculty, is a central ethos of Olin. Can you talk a little bit about how that works? So is it about selecting individuals into that community who are willing to do that? Is there much sort of peer-to-peer work, or is this, right? And what role do you play as a leader in those conversations about directions?
Right. So I would say there's a combination, actually. There's a combination of peer-to-peer. There's a combination of students pushing. Like our students will send notes, like, what are you doing about this? Like, and I think we need to have a session on this. Faculty will do the same. People are empowered, which I think is really important as part of education, is this empowerment as a learner, empowerment as an educator. And so a lot of that too happens organically. For me as a leader, I want to be a part of it. So I engage with the community. If there's something where we're doing, where there's some group learning, like sign me up. But I also feel like I can suggest maybe we need to have some more conversations in a particular area. But this dynamic of like really coming together as a community, we have co-curriculars where students, faculty, and staff can work on a particular, suggest a course and design a new course. A lot of the work is team-based. So our faculty who are teaching courses, it's very much team-based teaching. A group of faculty members across disciplines working together on a particular course and involving the students along the way. I drop in on courses. I have done a few guest lectures myself, but it is like being part of the community, regardless of whether you're the student, the faculty member, staff, or the president, but feeling your place in that community, what's your role, and just embracing it and enjoying that part of it. I think part of my role too is to help facilitate and set the tone and the direction for these institutional priorities. One of our things that we're talking about now is we have this mindset around, you know, what is your individual motivation and what are you thinking about? But also, what is your motivation towards contributing to the institution, while you also think about your motivation for doing good in the world. So those kinds of mindsets and bringing them together for the community.
So as you describe this, I certainly think there are elements that are probably elsewhere, but it does seem like a very unusual, special community, right? This notion of empowerment, this notion of collective belonging and commitment to the institution. How do you cultivate that? Like, are there things, right? Is it sort of a community of Ascent and you simply facilitate and reinforce, or is this something that has to be created every single day, if you will?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot that you build on. There's things that you start out with, and you start out with values and how the institution was created in the first place and staying true to those values. So as we talk about the future, we're like, okay, here are these core values that are part of our culture that we don't lose. So you also think about like how you bring people together and how you're hearing those voices, but a lot of it is around culture. And culture is like unwritten rules and practices. It's like how you feel a part of a place or not. It's like, how do you foster and create environments and structures that give that sense of belonging and allow people to find their place in it. So some of it sort of bubbles up, some of it's intentional, but I do believe that if you want that kind of culture that you're building on through the values that you have shared and the goals that you're projecting, you have to work at it. You don't get to just say, there it is, it's just going to tend to itself and everything's going to be okay. I do think it's very important to be intentional in cultivating that kind of culture that allows us to stay that way, that everyone feels that they belong. And you create this kind of sense of, you know, we're all in here together as learners and educators. It's work, but not losing that sense of values.
Great. So an audience question that follows up on the Olin values. How do you help Olin graduates find workplaces that share the Olin values and vision? How can all of us help students prioritize and find a cultural fit as well as a job after graduation?
Well, I think now that people are being more outspoken about what it is who they are and what they stand for, that's including institutions and companies. I think what we can do is try to like learn, like, what are their goals and values, and do they match yours? And we as institutions and we as organizations can help with the communication back and forth and share that with students and help empower them to ask the questions themselves also. But I think there is this opportunity now to get a better sense of an organization or a company or an agency, who they are, what do they stand for, who works there. And that tells you something as well. We also have been working really hard to keep our alumni connected because they have been great ambassadors and great ones to help other graduates as they're coming out. One of the things that I noticed when I started with Olin has a very unique set of alumni as well. The experience is sufficiently differentiated and unique, and it's a small community that the identity of the alumni with Olin is huge. And so they're a great resource for each other and for the new graduates as well. And learning from them about what worked in terms of the kinds of positions that they went into. And the Olin alumni are also disproportionately represented in entrepreneurs who go off and start their own companies as well. So these are folks who are like, I don't see it out there, I'm gonna start it. So
Right.
that combination, I think, really has helped. And because the Oliners have done so well, people want our graduates. They really do, like regardless whether it be graduate school, another professional school, a company, an agency, whatever, the Olin graduates are in high demand. And so I really think that we are doing a good job in the alumni as well in helping find that good fit. So for everyone who is saying, okay, but we're not Olin, I think it's back to what I was saying, like learning more about the places and lining up goals and what people stand for.
Could it be also that, right, part of the DNA of Olin is this transforming engineering more generally? Could you imagine that the right proliferation of Olin graduates into business places that might not share those values may actually transform the values there into more
Absolutely. Yeah, and actually that's part of the plan, you know, go out and be amongst others and people can learn that way. That's a fantastic way of learning. And so the partnership piece of like going out and bringing people in, because we want to do it faster and more. And so that kind of sharing really makes a difference. So I'm glad you brought that up because it really does make a difference.
Great. So the next one, audience question. Can you share a personal story, how the intersectionality of your identities serves your leadership approach in working along with stakeholders who don't reflect those identities? Representation matters to me, so please share how you lead as only one in the room, especially in the area of leadership in STEM.
Oh my goodness, what, what a fantastic question. So I have so many stories, like, let me find the ways. I'll try to find a common thread. But as a Black woman, often in spaces, being the only woman, the only Black, the only person of color, I have learned to enter spaces, and I talk about like being a tempered radical, where you kind of like get in, and so you're the outsider within. You are learning the system so that you can affect change. And so for me, it's been really important that I've learned a lot from that solo experience so often that I understand what it's like not to be included. And so I'm very intentional and purposeful in trying to create environments for inclusion. I understand the importance of being at the table and having a voice and bringing in the different perspectives. And so I work to making sure that we have environments that bring in multiple perspectives. And so back to what I mean about tempered radicalism, you really need to be present and understand the ways of doing and being in a particular context, in a particular situation, so that you can help open doors for others. And for me, it's like constant. how do I make sure that someone else can get in and not have to go through what I had to go through? How do I make sure that we are creating the access to opportunities? Because oftentimes it's that the person didn't even have the opportunity. And so keeping the dialogue going and bringing in the different perspectives, I think it's definitely helped me get to where I am in my own career. And so for those who are feeling sort of solo and isolated, like, don't be afraid to use your voice, and also draw on the support of others. Sometimes we can't do it alone. So reach out to those who are reachable, and try to get some collective movement that way, and draw on the ones who are clearly supporters, because we really can't do it alone, but we definitely need to try.
Great. In these conversations, we usually end with a question about what the speaker is most hopeful about. And so as you begin your second year at Olin, but also as you look nationally, internationally, are there things you're most hopeful about?
Yeah, I will say what I'm most hopeful about is the young people. The young people saying, you know what, enough already. I don't want to hear all this talk. I want to see action, and being demanding of it. And also like understanding that we are at a reckoning and we need to do something differently. Those young, powerful voices that aren't afraid to actually put some action behind what they're talking about. And they're not afraid to push the ones, maybe they're older or maybe they're, more positioned. They're not afraid to demand more of us, of ourselves. I'm very hopeful about that. I see that as something that finding that voice, using it, and demanding that we all do better, demanding that we find our better selves, and that we work on behalf of others, especially those who can't do it for themselves, demanding that we do take a stand and do something against systemic racism, demanding that we use technology responsibly. I'm very hopeful. I think the youth it's always been the case that the youth's our future, still the case.
Wonderful. Would you have any final words of advice for us as educators?
Well, for us as educators, I'd say we need to be open and be learners as well. Like you never finish learning. This concept of lifelong learning is really important. And for educators, we need to think about who it is we are educating and work collectively together, but be open to be learners ourselves.
I like how that returns to the Olin way of co-creation.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is now a term I'm going to use all the time.
Great.
So with that, thank you so very, very much. We really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your perspective and a bit of your work at Olin College. Next Tuesday, the Virtues and Vocations seminar has Nikki Washington on why computer science should care about education. So thank you for everybody who joined us today, and hope to see you next week. And thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you
and
so much.
Fingers crossed that we're all back in person in the fall.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.